Hi, thanks for sticking out to the end of the day. I know you're all just here because happy hour is right after me, so sorry you have to listen to me talk for a while before you get your drinks. I'm going to talk about responsive design today, and probably most of you know what responsive design is, but there's probably some of you that don't yet. I'm not going to ask who and have you raise your hands because I know nobody likes it when the speaker points out what you don't know, so don't worry, I won't embarrass you. But I'm going to go over just really quickly what responsive design is if you're not familiar with it already. So responsive websites, this idea came about a few years ago when smartphones came out, the iPhone and other smartphones, and they started getting popular, and we wanted to have websites that would work on any size screen. At first, they started just doing separate mobile sites, but then you had to maintain 2 separate websites for your company or your project. So the idea of responsive web design is you're creating one website that works on every size screen. And it has, back in the code, you have one set of code, but the code can change how the site looks depending on the screen size. So whatever you have on the small screen, it might look different on the large screen. It's the same website with the same content, the same code, but it's going to look a little bit different because you want it to work well for the screen size that you're viewing the site on. So that's what responsive design is. And responsive design consists of 2 main qualities. And the first thing is that responsive sites are flexible. And what that means is that the different parts of the site are going to be flexible within the boundaries of the size of the screen. So for example, here you can see the columns are getting narrower and wider depending on the size of the screen as we view the website. On an old style site, a fixed width site, it doesn't change. It's not flexible. So if you're using a smaller screen size, you just get everything cut off. Otherwise, you know, on phones or whatever, they might make the site really small, so you have to zoom in and out to see things, but it's not flexible. And to make things flexible on a responsive site, you just use percentages for horizontal widths instead of fixed widths, like with pixels, which are fixed and can't change. If you don't know code, I'm going to have a little bit of CSS and HTML in here, but this is just to get an idea of how it works. If you're a designer, even if you don't know any code at all, you need to kind of know what's possible with the code so that you can make things that the developers can build. The second quality of responsive websites is that they're adjustable. And that means what you see on the screen can change and move around depending on the size of the screen. For example, this site, the United Pixel Workers site, if you look on it on a small screen, you just have 1 column of text. But if you look at a wider screen, it changes to 2 columns as it gets wider. If you look at this right here on the top, you have a drop-down navigation, but if you go to a wider screen size where there's more space, that changes to horizontal navigation. And as the screen gets wider, the number of columns changes and the layout changes. So no matter the screen size, it's taking advantage of all the space that's available for the website. And this adjustable part of responsive design is a little bit trickier, and we use something called media queries in CSS. So you're starting with, for example, on that site, if the content's in an article element in HTML, you might give it a width and percent of 92%, so there's margins on the side. And then you add a media query. And what the media query does is it asks a question to the browser. And that's the part that's highlighted in yellow there. It's saying to the browser, if the browser window is a width of 40 ems or wider, which is about tablet size, add this extra CSS in there and make the article maybe a width of 70% and float it to the left, like if you're doing a 2-column layout. So only if the browser window is that wide or wider is it going to take that CSS and apply it, giving the site a different style than if it was on a narrower screen. So putting together flexible and adjustable, you get this. You see the pieces are flexible as the screen width changes, but also the number of columns changes, the navigation changes, the banner changes. And remember, this isn't a mobile site. This is just one set of code that changes based on the size of the screen. So the way you're used to defining websites the old way, you thought of it as a canvas. And that's what you get when you open up Photoshop or design program. You have a canvas that you design in. But a canvas, like with a painter, a canvas is fixed in size. Your size, your canvas doesn't change. So you're only creating a design that fits on one size. And that doesn't really work in responsive design. You need to think about it differently because you're designing for all these different canvases, not just one size on a desktop monitor, but all these different phones and tablets and laptops and then larger screens and TVs and pretty much every possible size of screen that you can think of. So the design process for responsive sites works a little bit differently. And you might be used to using kind of a waterfall process when you do the old style of fixed-width sites. The designer starts at the beginning. You create your design in Photoshop. You make comps and hand them off to the developer. They code the site, and you never look at it again after you hand off your comps. The designer just designs, and then it goes to the developer, and it just is a one-way street. But that doesn't work in responsive design because there's so many moving parts and so many things that need to change and be different depending on the screen size. The designer and developer need to work together throughout the process because otherwise, if you design it and give it to the developer, they're going to end up having to make a lot of design decisions to make it work on the different screen sizes, and you don't want to leave that to them because they're not the designer, you are. So instead of a waterfall process, well, okay, I don't know what the opposite of waterfall is, but this is a whirlpool, and that's what it might feel like at first, because it's a very different process. Things are going around. You're not just working in your own little bubble where you can create this design and then you're done. You have to be involved in the entire process all the way along, even if it's confusing, especially when you're new to responsive design. It's going to be confusing. It's going to be difficult. You're not going to know what you need to do to make things work right. And it's a learning process. And this is a quote that I really like. Dan Willis is a UX designer. And he said this, it's not like our industry nailed web design before we started doing responsive design. It's still a work in progress. Web design has always been a work in progress. That's why we have new versions of HTML and CSS that come along every couple years. The way that the code work changes, the way that standards work change, the way that design changes over time. And we do things differently. That's how web design has always been. It's always changed to take advantage of new technologies as they come along. So responsive design is just one more change as we come along. And you don't need to be an expert at it right away. You just need to keep learning so that you can create sites that are responsive, that work on all these different screen sizes. And you'll get better at it if it's difficult right away. So as you're putting together a responsive site, the first thing you want to look at is the content. And this is important because, really content, that's the most important part of the site, right? Because people are coming to the site because you're trying to get a message across to them, or you're allowing them to interact with the site and make things happen. For the most part, people aren't coming to the site to see your design. They're not like, oh, this is a wonderful looking site. I want to just go look at it and admire it. We all wish that would happen, but that's not really the way the world works. No, they're coming to get our content. They're coming to interact. And the design goes on top of that. And yes, they're going to like the design and admire it, but you have to remember that the design can't get in the way of the content because that's what they're there for, the content, the message, the interaction. So, as much as you're thinking about design, you need to remember that that's not the most important thing. The design needs to enhance the content and not get in the way of that. So as we're starting with our content, really, the tricky part about responsive design is getting things to work well on a small screen because there's a lot less space to work with, and it's harder for the user to get through this because they have to scroll to get to things. It's a little bit more frustrating. So you want to make sure the small screen works really well. And when a user goes to this, there's pretty much only one thing that they can do. They can scroll from top to bottom to look at all the content. There's not multiple columns. There's not things over here and things over here. So when you're putting the content on the small screen, basically you have a linear design of how somebody's going to get through the content. So you want to make sure the most important things are at the top, and then as you go down, the next most important thing, what you want them to read next, and so forth. So as a designer, you might not before have been involved in the content, but this is really important as you're designing the site to be able to take the content, and I mean the real content for the website, not fake content like lorem ipsum, and figure out how this content will look on the page and how your design can help the message get across better. And using fake content like lorem ipsum or fake titles or placeholders, the problem you have is they end up not looking like your real content. And you might say, put a test title in your design that's 4 words long and not realize that the real titles are all 20 words long, and that's really going to look different. So you need to be able to use this real content and plan with it. That doesn't mean it needs to be the final content for the site. It just needs to be, representative of what the real content is going to look like. So as someone's using the site on the small screen, they're just going from top to bottom. They're looking at the most important things first. People don't always scroll all the way down, so we have to make sure that if there's something we want them to see, it needs to be near the top, because they might not make it to the bottom. So designing for small screen first. Obviously, when you have a responsive website, you want to design how it looks for all the different screen widths. And you're going to think about these things, and starting from the desktop might seem easier because you're already used to designing for desktop-sized screens. And it's pretty easy because you know how to do that. You've been doing that for years. You can fit everything in there in columns really nice. But the way I like to think about this, it's like imagine that you live in a small apartment and you're moving to a house, right? So you move all your stuff into the house. There's plenty of room for everything. Just fill up all the rooms. There's lots of empty space. You can maybe add some extra pictures on their wall because there's space for them. But if you've ever tried moving from a house you've lived in for years with all this stuff and going to a small apartment, it's just not going to fit. You're going to have boxes stacked in the hallway and there's no place to unpack them. It's just a lot harder to take a lot of stuff and put it into a small space than the other way around. So Washington Post, they don't have a responsive site. They have a separate mobile site, and they realized this. They looked at their desktop content and said, this isn't all going to fit. So we're just going to put less content on our mobile site. And that's actually good because there's less distractions to keep people from getting to the things that they want to read. There's just the stories and navigation and just the important parts. And when you go back and look at the desktop site compared to the mobile site, there's a lot getting in your way of getting to the content because there's so much information on there. And actually, if you look in the entire Washington Post front page, I counted the number of links in here. It's over 400 links. And it's just like, wow, that's just too much information for anybody to get through on one page and get to the thing that they want to see. So by starting with a small screen, you can really think about what's important and audit the content that you have and get rid of the things that don't need to be there. And I don't mean just cut everything off the site entirely, but put things in places that make sense so as people go through pages on the site, it's easy for them to navigate through the page and they're not having to deal with all these extra distractions. So early in the design process, you're going to be doing wireframes. And this might be something that an information architect does and passes on to you. And it just kind of determines the basic layout of the page. And, for fixed width websites, this wasn't too hard. They maybe just do two for the front page and interior page, something like that. For a responsive site, you can do multiple wireframes, maybe for phone width, tablet width, desktop width. But that still won't give you a picture of what the website is going to look like at all possible device widths, because not every device is going to be exactly one of these three widths. So you can put together responsive prototypes. And what that is, it's a wireframe that's on the screen and is responsive in the browser. And one of the easy ways to do this is to use a framework. And there's a couple popular ones like Foundation or Bootstrap. And basically what a framework is you download a bunch of code from them. It's HTML and CSS. And they give you instructions how to use the CSS classes to put a page together very quickly. And even if you only know a little bit of CSS, it's pretty easy to follow the instructions. You just use certain classes to make a certain number of columns, that sort of thing. And you get something that looks like this. This is a responsive prototype. You view it in the browser, and you can make it any screen width, just like you would a regular website. But looking at it, it's very clear that this isn't a website, right? It's just very basic. There's image placeholders. The text isn't heavily styled. But there is some light styling, for example, like the forms or paragraphs and headings. So when you look at this, it looks attractive. You can see which are the headings. It's not just no style whatsoever, but you can get a good idea of what a website is going to look like at different screen widths. You can also make responsive prototypes with online tools. This one is called Hot Glue. There's several others if you just Google or search for responsive prototypes. And this just allows you to design a wireframe or a layout like you would with a normal design tool, but it allows you to add breakpoints so you can make a wireframe that works at different screen sizes and see how it looks. As you're putting together a responsive site, one of the most important things to think about is typography, because the words on the page are going to look different depending on whether you're in a small screen or a large screen or something in between. This is an example of a responsive website that belongs to Trent Walton, who's a designer. And I'm going to show you how it looks at different screen sizes. And if you watch, as the screen gets wider, the size of the text changes, it gets bigger. The size of the margins and the white space change, and get larger to accommodate the larger text size. And it still fits on the screen. So if you had just started with the text that you saw on the small screen and made the screen wider without changing the text, it wouldn't look that great because the text would look too small for the screen. So by making the text larger to go along with the size of the screen, everything is just going to fit better and look more appropriate for the screen size. But you also don't want to have too large text on your small screen because it's going to take up a lot of that valuable space and make it harder for the user to get through the site. As you're doing responsive typography, you're going to use different measurement units than you would for a fixed width site. Normally you'd use pixels or something like that. If you're working in something like Photoshop, you might use points and have them translated to pixels. So you're used to deciding exactly what the size of the text is and then having the developer do that. But with responsive sites, we're going to use rems and ems, which are relative units, and they allow the size of the font or the size of the text to change based on the device that you're viewing the site on. Ems and rems work very similar. The only difference between them is how they calculate the size in relation to the default font size. Ems are named after the letter M. You know, in metal typesetting, they determine the size of the typeface by the width of the letter M, which is the widest letter in the alphabet. So it's actually a common myth that that has something to do with how M's work on websites. But although that's where their name comes from, it actually has nothing to do with that. Here we have 4 different capital M's in different typefaces, and they're all in boxes with the width of 1 M across. And you can tell that the M is the same size no matter what typeface you're using, no matter how big the M is. So if you thought that your letter M would have something to do with the size of the M, it doesn't. So just so everybody's clear on that. So the 1 M is your default font size on a website. And that's what you're going to start with for body text like paragraphs, lists, that sort of thing. 2 M's then is twice as big. It's pretty simple math. 2 is twice as big as 1. 0.5 M's is half as big as your default font size. The CSS for this might look something like this, with your H1 is 3 M's, so it's 3 times as large as your paragraphs, and so on. And so you're wondering, well, 1 M, I'm saying that's the default font size. Well, what is it? Where does that come from? How big is 1 M? Well, the device will actually determine that for you when you set the font size on the body element. By setting a font size of 100%, and this is the only time you use 100% for the font size when you're on a website. Everywhere else you use M's or rems. So use 100% there, and what that does, it tells the device to use the font size that that device thinks is the best reading size for text on that device. So it's not going to be exactly the same on every device. On a desktop computer, 100% is going to be 16 pixels, just so you have an idea of what it looks like. But not every device is going to use that same size. But really the cool thing here is that no matter what device it is, if it's 100%, that device is going to pick a font size that's large enough that people can read it easily on that device. And that's important because not everybody has great eyesight, and especially older people. Once you get to about 40, your near vision starts to deteriorate. And I'm just about to 40, so I've noticed that happening, and that happens to pretty much everybody. It's just a fact of life. So if you've ever gone to an office where there's some older people there, you'll notice they're all kind of leaning towards their screens and squinting because it's hard to see things, because websites tend to make their type too small, and just everything's really small. So you don't want to put people through that. You want to make sure the text is large enough so most of the users, nearly all the users coming to your website will be able to read it easily without squinting or without having to do something themselves to the computer to make it bigger. Sometimes that'll look too big. 16 pixels looks too big to some people because we're used to making text 10 or 12 pixels on a website. So if 16 pixels looks really big, the issue you're having here is scale. Everything else needs to get big along with the text. So if your text is 16 pixels, that means you need more white space, and all the different things around the page are going to need to be bigger in relation to that bigger text. So you can't do everything the same size as you used to and just make the text bigger. You have to make everything big all at once so that they have appropriate scale next to each other. Another thing to think about on responsive websites is line length, which is also called measure. And this is how many characters are in a line. And you can see here that the lines are very, very long. You know, this is hard to read. When your eyes go from the end of one line to the beginning of the next line, it's hard for you to get to the right line because they're so far apart. So it makes it more physically challenging for it to read. It's kind of a subconscious thing, but if you're trying to read this, you're not going to like reading it because the long lines make it hard to read. You have a problem also with short lines like this. Your eyes have no problem getting from one line to the next, but because the lines are so short, your eyes keep moving back and forth more often, and it's tiring to your eyes. So if you're reading body text that looks like this, it's also going to be a subconscious thing that you're going to not like reading it as much because it's going to be harder for your eyes to read it. So they've done studies to determine how long lines should be, and they figured out it should be 45 to 75 characters across on average. And this can vary a little bit depending on the typeface or other things, but generally if you're within this range on text, then you're doing a good job of making sure the text is as readable as possible. So on responsive sites, obviously the width changes, and you don't want it to be wider than 75 characters, but if you're using percentage widths where everything keeps changing, how do you make sure it's not? And you do that by using max width, which is part of CSS. And what that does is it can tell any element not to get larger than a certain width. And the code is pretty simple. For example, here we have a paragraph. I've highlighted in red 45 to 75 characters so you can see where they are. And the first line goes all the way to 75 characters right at the end. So this is a good maximum for the length of lines. So you just need to figure out how long it is in M's. It's going to vary a little bit but on the typeface and other things. You need to kind of do trial and error to figure it out. It's usually between 26 and 30 M's. So figure out what that sweet spot is there, and then you're just going to add a max width to that element of whatever that number is. And then if you make the window wider, that paragraph's never going to get wider than 75 characters. So it's going to always stay within that good reading length. So the problem we have now is we look at it, there's too much white space here on the sides. So what can we do to take care of that? Well, you go back and start with your narrower width, and you make it wider to a point at which you're just like, hey, now it needs more white space, now that the screen is this wide, or less white space, actually. So now you can add code, and this is where you'd add a media query, because you want to change something at this screen width or wider. So what this code is here, we're having a media query, so we're asking a question to the browser. We're saying, is the screen at least 48 M's or wider? If it is, I'm going to increase the font size a little bit, increase the line height and the margin to go along with it. So what happens if you make it a little bit wider past that breakpoint, it'll get a little bit, the text will get bigger and the margin on the side will get smaller, so it'll look better on the page. So you can keep doing that as you make the screen wider. You look at it at wider widths. You can make the text wider, like on the example we saw, so it gets larger text on wider screens, and everything's in a good scale and in proportion to each other. Sometimes when you look at a website, the typeface might need to change depending on the size of the screen. For example, on this site, they have their slogan at the top of the screen. It's kind of long. They use an interesting typeface that goes along with their branding. That's great. So it looks okay on the screen size, but when you look at this site on a small screen, the slogan, you can't even read the whole slogan without scrolling. And to me, I look at this, I'm like, well, couldn't they at least just put the whole slogan on the screen so I wouldn't have to scroll to read what they're about? It would just look a little bit better if you could see it all at once. But they're using this kind of unusual typeface that really isn't going to look good if you make it smaller, so we can't do that. So this is kind of where you might need a trade-off. If you really want to have this long slogan in this typeface, if it doesn't work on a small screen, you can just use a different typeface only for that small screen. And yes, that means maybe you're not using that fancy typeface you really like, but if the trade-off is readability or getting people a better user experience on your site, sometimes that's a trade-off you have to make. So in this case, you just start off maybe with some sort of default font or just a different font, and then use a media query and say, for example, if the screen is 30 M's or wider, I can increase the font size and then use the font family to use Populaire, which is the typeface that they chose. So that's something that you might not do often, but in a case like that, you might look at it and be like, I really need to do something different because this just isn't working on the small screen. So anytime you want to make a change and have something look different based on the screen size, you can do that really easily with a media query. So mobile really is the challenge. When you're doing responsive sites, the problem isn't necessarily making it responsive, it's making it work well on mobile. Because we're not used to that yet. We're good at designing desktop sites, but there's a lot of things about mobile that just work differently. Really, the major thing here is touch. We access mobile websites differently. We use our big fat fingers to poke at things instead of using a cursor like we do on a desktop computer. That little computer, when you're using your mouse, it's really easy to get to a link and click on the right thing. But when you're using your big fat fingers on a small screen, all the time I'm sure you have this problem. You just keep hitting the wrong thing because there's two links or two buttons really close together. So that's something you need to think about as you're designing. That's not a visual thing, that's a user experience thing, but it needs to be part of the visual design, that your buttons and links need to be large enough so it's easy for people to click on them. And there's a standard for this. There's a few different standards people throw on, but kind of a generally accepted one is that anything that people need to touch or tap on should be at least 44 pixels by 44 pixels. So that's kind of a starting place. It doesn't have to be that big, but especially if you have two things right next to each other, like in the navigation or buttons, it's really important that they're large enough so you don't hit the wrong thing. Another issue that you have with mobile phones and touchscreens is there's some things that you just can't do. For example, on a desktop site, you might use hover. Say you have like a gallery of images and you hover over each one to get the caption for it, which a lot of galleries do, and it's a really nice effect. But if you're using a touch screen, you can't hover. You know, you can't just hover your finger over your phone, so you're never going to get to see those captions. So as you're designing, you need to think about that. You know, that might be something that looks really cool, but if it doesn't work on touch screens, you're making the site not work correctly for a lot of users. And you can't just use media queries to make it different for small or large screens, because when it comes to touch screens, a touch screen can be any size. They're not just phones and tablets anymore. You know, you can get big desktop monitors that are touch screens. So if somebody's using one of those, they're also not going to be able to use the hover effect. Another thing to think about with mobile is sometimes people are out looking for things really fast on their phones. So you want to make it as easy as possible for people to get information that they need. Because it's that small screen, there's less that they can see at one time, and it's just harder to navigate through it. And not everybody uses a mobile phone when they're out and about. You know, a lot of times you're home on your sofa using it, you're just browsing, you know, and that's fine. And it's pretty easy to browse on a site no matter what. But when you're out there and you need to get something quickly, you know, the designer should make sure that they've done everything to make it so you can get to that information as quickly as possible. This is a site that I really like what they've done here. It's Kiwi Bank in Australia. And on the small screen version of their site, and this is a responsive site, so this is all done with CSS. On the small screen site, they have 3 big buttons at the top. Log into mobile banking, find a branch, and call us at our phone number. And then the hours right below that. So if you're out somewhere, you need to look really quick. You're on the way to the bank and you need to know what the hours are. Or you need to find the branch or something like that. You can pull out your mobile phone and you'll get to those right away. You know, and they've clearly probably looked at their stats and figured out these are the things people go to most often on mobile phones. So this is great. They're really easy to get to. On the desktop screen, because this is a responsive site, they've used media queries to make it a little bit different. You don't see those same big links right at the top. Because since the desktop size site is easier to navigate, they can easily just see that internet banking login right up there in the corner. There's contact us they can click on to get the branches, the phone number, all of that stuff. So, but even though the small screen site just has these buttons highlighted at the top, you can still get to the rest of the content. If you're sitting at home on your sofa and you really want to browse and find out what today's interest rates are, you can do that. They're just not right at the top because that's not the information that people are likely looking for in a hurry. Another cool thing you can do, speaking of telephone numbers, is you can make a telephone number on a site a link, which is really cool. If somebody's looking on their mobile phone to get the phone number of a business or something, they can just click on a phone number to call it. And there's really simple HTML to do it. You just make it like a link, and instead of putting a URL in there, you put TEL : and the phone number, and then the phone will know that you can click on that to call the number. So that's kind of just an example of little tweaks you can make to make sites work better for users, especially on small screens where it's harder to navigate, it's harder to get through things. You want to make this experience as easy as possible. Performance is something that you need to think about when you're designing websites. This wasn't so important a few years ago when we were all just using desktop computers in our offices and homes. But now that people are using mobile phones that sometimes are very, very slow, you want to make sure that your site is as fast as possible. But this doesn't just apply to people using mobile phones and small screens. You know, I'm sure we've all had the experience of being in a hotel where the Wi-Fi is just so slow. You know, and you're on a laptop, you're not on a small screen. But you'd still be able to take advantage of having a site that is going to load faster. You can't mock up performance in Photoshop. from Brad Frost, who's a designer. And this is true. You're not thinking about performance as you design a site. That's not part of the visual thing that you see in front of you. But it is a really, really important part of design because the user experience of the site is not just what they see, but how they experience the site. So if they go to the site and it's really, really slow, you know what? They're going to give up and go away and go to somebody else's site, and they're never even going to see your design. So that's why performance, is important. You want it, the quicker that the site loads, the more they're going to engage with the site, the more likely they are to come back. So as a designer, you can't always do a lot about performance, but what you can do is make sure that it's part of the conversation all the way along throughout the design process. And one thing that's starting to become more popular is doing a performance budget. And this is something you do with the requirements right at the beginning of the site, is decide how fast you want the site to be. And this might be, well, each page should be no more than 500 kilobytes. Or the home page should load in 8 seconds or less on a 3G connection. And there's different numbers you can throw in here. But really, it's just saying we want the site to be at least this fast. And then as you're going through designing the site, there might be things that you want to add, but they're going to add to how long the site takes to download. Like Jen was talking about fonts. The more fonts you have, the longer it takes to get them all on the site. So using less fonts will make a site go faster. Or it might be, having a big carousel on the front page of the site with a bunch of huge images in it. That takes a lot of bandwidth to download. Is it worth it to have that on the site if it's going to make it download slower for a lot of people? Images are a big problem, one of the biggest issues facing performance on a responsive site. This is something on the developer's end that they can work with and fix that you can't necessarily do anything about on your end. Another thing is social media icons, and this is a really big problem because you'll have a service and you'll get this code you just embed on the site that does Facebook and Twitter and all these different icons. And then you see a plus on the end, which means more, and you click on that, and there's 80 more icons for every possible service you can imagine. So you're putting on this on the site, and there's all these little images it has to download, and then the code for all this, all the HTML. And let me tell you, if you look at one of these, they don't really do a good job of optimizing the code. There's so much extra in there. So putting a little thing on your site can actually noticeably increase the download time for the site. So you need to think about, if one of the stakeholders is like, oh yeah, we need those Twitter buttons and everything on there, it's your job to explain to them, hey, we can do that, but it's going to increase the download time of the site, and that's going to mean maybe people going away unhappy or not even coming to the site anymore. And is it worth it? There's a lot of other things with performance that are done on the developer's end, so you might not even be aware of them or know about them. But the developers, even though they know about all these things, might not bother to do them. So as you go through the process and the site is being built, if it seems like it's not fast enough, be asking the developers, are we doing everything we can to make the performance good on this site? Because, they're not thinking about it. They maybe aren't worrying about the users. They just want to get the code on the page. So it's your job to kind of hold them to this and make sure that they're trying to meet whatever performance budget you start at the beginning of the process. So testing is the last thing. After you've gone through the process, design the site, you should be testing all along in different devices, but then at the end, you probably have a checklist of all these different devices, and you want to make sure the site works on different devices, on different browsers, on different operating systems. And this is something also that the developers probably do, but you should be doing it as well because you want to know if your design has problems on certain devices. And you might be able to catch things the developers won't see. And if there are problems, you should be working with the developer to figure out what can be done to solve them, what needs to happen. And a site is not going to look the exact same on every device, and that's something you need to make sure the clients or the stakeholders are aware of from the start, that when they get to the end and they're looking at their phone and they're looking at their laptop and they're looking at their tablet, they're not going to see the exact same thing. This actually happens that, designers will work with clients and not communicate this, and they'll get to the end of the project, and the client will be like, why does this look different on my phone? If that happens, you weren't communicating as well as you should have with the client. That's really, really important because your client might not understand responsive design yet. So make sure they understand that it's going to look different on every device. Although it's going to look different, it's going to look like the same design, but it might look slightly different. Like the font size might be different on different phones because the browser just renders it differently. So just be aware it's not going to always look the same, but it should still look good and it should still work well no matter what device you're using. Obviously, you don't have piles and piles of different phones and tablets around your office, so then how do you test? Well, there's a bunch of different online services you can use. You just go to a website and put in the URL of your site, and you can choose to see how it would look on different devices, different browsers, different operating systems. There's all these different versions of Android because people don't always update their phones, so you have to make sure it looks good on the previous version and the one before that. And it's not necessarily going to look the same as what's in the current version because there's always quirks that make things look different. There's also device labs, which is kind of a new idea the last couple years. And these are like publicly accessible places where a company or organization has gathered together a whole bunch of devices, and you can go in there and use these devices to test your design, sometimes for free or sometimes for a small fee. And I know there's one in DC that just opened last year, the DC Device Lab, and they're in a whole bunch of cities now. So that's a great thing to check out if you don't have access to a lot of devices to test, but you do want to test on real devices. Because even if you're using online service to see how it looks on different devices, you need to make sure that you're seeing how the site works. When you touch the different things on the screen, is the menu easy to work with and navigate on a small screen on a phone when you're just using your finger to get through it? So if you're not testing on actual devices, you might not have an idea of, if the navigation is hard to tap the icons or whatever on a touch screen. So in conclusion, there's a lot to responsive design. And as a designer, it's just important that you understand how responsive design works and what's possible. So even if you're not the one implementing it, you can design something that takes advantage of all the good parts of responsive design and that's going to work well and look good in the end. You can't just take design and hand it off to developer and expect that what comes back is going to look how you're imagining it, because it's not. If you're not involved in the whole process, they're going to end up making a lot of design decisions for you, and they might not be the decisions you would have made. So learn all you can about responsive design, and that will help you create sites that look good and work well on all the different possible devices out there. Thank you.